Kia ora and welcome to CIO Leadership Live. I'm your host, Kathy O'Sullivan, the editor for CIO New Zealand. And I'm delighted to welcome my guest today, Josh Robb, who's the Chief Product and Technology Officer at Tend. Tanakwe, Josh, how are you?
Kia ora.
Welcome and congratulations in being in the top 10 for the CIO 50 this year. Very exciting. So for those of us that don't know a lot of Tend, can you tell us a bit more about your role there and what your team does?
Yeah, cool. So maybe from the top down. So Tend is a really interesting business. It's a technology business and a healthcare provider. So we're kind of in health tech. But we also we're not just providing software or kind of technology services, we're also hiring nurses and doctors and other kinds of specialist roles and running physical medical centres that we own. So one way to think of us is kind of a vertically integrated health technology business. And my role is to run the technology side of things. So my team we have an app and some supporting infrastructure, and then obviously a whole bunch of other kind of internal systems and things. So I'm kind of responsible for the development and build of the app from a product perspective, the internal infrastructure and systems we need to run the business. And then I'm also really, really involved in the kind of business operations and kind of generating operational efficiency. So I do a lot of work really closely with our customer service team and with our clinical teams to try and improve the workforce experience and to improve patient healthcare outcomes and to make the business more efficient. So quite a few different hats that I wear.
Yeah, indeed. And, obviously it's an exciting space to be in. And, transformation, it's thrown around quite a bit as, a word. It's a bit of a buzzword and it's seen as a given within some organizations. But in reality, as you'll know from your experience working at Tend and elsewhere, transformation isn't easy. So can you talk us through about how that approach has taken shape in your own career?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have consistently chosen to work with or for extremely entrepreneurial people throughout my career. So I've quite often joined businesses or startups quite earlier in their life cycle. My previous job was working for Pushpay. I was sort of the third or fourth software engineer there, and maybe, employee 12 or something. And then we grew very, very rapidly from 12 to sort of 400 or 500 people. And the team that I was running by the time I left was kind of over 100 people. So that was a crazy ride. But when I look back, I've kind of consistently chosen to work with these crazy, idealist, dreamer, entrepreneur people that are trying to do something new. And so I have a huge amount of regard and respect for technologists that lead functions in more traditional businesses that are more established, because they have a real different set of problems from what I've typically encountered in my career. Taking an existing organization and bringing it on a journey requires a whole bunch of sort of negotiation and stakeholder management skills that, I haven't necessarily got the patience to deal with, to be completely honest. In startups, it's much, much easier to go really, really fast because there's not very much there. And so there's kind of a bit less negotiation and a bit more like, hey, here's the goal we want to get to. How are we going to align as a small group around getting there as quickly as we can? And so the hard bit there is kind of controlling what problems you take on and how you decide to address them. And so for Tend started because we were Cecilia and James Robinson, who started My Food Bag, and before that they had another business called Opearlink, had been looking at healthcare for quite a long time. In fact, before they started My Food Bag, they'd been talking about doing a healthcare business, but they had this food product idea as well. And so we did that first and it kind of took off. But they are hardcore consumer product people. And their whole kind of question with every interaction in their life is, how can we make this better for the consumers of this product or service? And they have very high standards and very low kind of thresholds for frustration. So they were really saw a huge opportunity to improve the way that healthcare services is delivered from a customer perspective. There's lots of really interesting people who are working really, really hard, who are incredibly skilled working in healthcare in this country. But there's often not consideration for what the consumer experience looks like. If you kind of could get in a time machine and go back 50 years, many aspects of your primary care experience going to visit a doctor would be very familiar to you today. Yeah, there's a computer on the desk now, but you'd still get in your car, you'd drive to the surgery, you might call them on the phone and make an appointment. And so Teresa Getting, who's the chair of our board, she used to be the CEO of Spark, and she tells a story at events where she says, In the early 2000s, when she was running Spark, they kind of had this big strategic offsite to talk about the impact of the internet on their business and what they thought it might mean in terms of changes in different sectors. And they identified healthcare as one of the big opportunities for this new internet thing to kind of potentially change modes of operation and lead to better outcomes and whatever else. And in the intervening sort of 20 years, the internet has revolutionized dating, but it hasn't really changed how healthcare is delivered or what the experience of healthcare services look like in New Zealand. And that's not the case offshore. When you look internationally, if you look in Europe or you look in North America, telehealth has been a thing for 10 years. There's very large telehealth providers in most of the Northern Hemisphere providing services to patients and employing doctors and stuff. But that hasn't been the case in New Zealand. But when we started looking at the problem space, we realized that we weren't going to be able to transform healthcare by just providing technology or by just offering kind of digital telehealth services, because that's only a partial solution from a consumer perspective. And we weren't going to be able to solve the whole problem. So it's great if you can have your problem resolved via telehealth, but if you can't, and that was all we were doing, then we'd have to hand you over to someone else to deal with giving you vaccinations or with dealing with a physical exam that was required, or wound care. There's obviously lots of kinds of things in health that require a physical examination or intervention as opposed to just advice and medication. So we decided we wanted to solve the whole customer problem. And so the transformation for us was, okay, if we want to solve the whole customer problem, that means we have to learn how to run medical centers. That means that we have to learn how to hire doctors and kind of organize medical centers and all that kind of stuff. And so it's been a really fascinating learning experience over the last couple of years, figuring out how to do that, starting from not really knowing very much about it, not necessarily having quite the right people in the building. And for startups, the most important thing is kind of getting the right mix of entrepreneurial energy, the startup energy, with a little bit of expertise and experience, and kind of blending that together in a way that you kind of get the best of both worlds. You don't kind of fall into obvious fear traps on day one.
So just on that, what were some of the key steps that you had to take along the way from getting Tend from this idea of revolutionizing healthcare to actually the product? And obviously you've got your physical clinics as well. What were the key steps you had to take along the way?
So when I think about startups, there's kind of probably three key things. So you need some access to capital. You need a kind of a strategy or a plan for how you think the business is going to eventually become profitable, or how are you going to make money. You need a clear answer to that question, and you need access to the right talent. And so when we were starting Tend, we spent a lot of time reading a lot of stuff and doing a lot of research and just trying to make sure that we understood the dynamics of the market, where the opportunities were, what the challenges might be. I'm really lucky that I've worked with a lot of really great people in New Zealand over the last, 10 or 15 years. And so I've got a bit of a network that I can tap in terms of access to technical talent, which is great. And the nice thing about Tend actually has been that from a mission perspective, it really resonates with people. People love to be able to tell their families that they're working to help improve healthcare for people. That's an exciting job to tell people about. If you're a technologist, if you're a software developer or a product manager or a designer, or even in IT support, it's great. That's not an important function, but it's kind of like everyone's kind of like, hey, I'm not just doing my job, I'm doing my job in a way that kind of improves the well-being of society and people around me. So kind of getting the right talent, getting access to the right capital, and kind of having a business plan that seems credible is kind of the three enabling kind of things that you always start with.
So you mentioned there, and I love the word, by the way, bear traps. It is challenging, whether you're a startup or whether you are in a legacy organization trying to transform things. What are some of the kind of common roadblocks or things to consider when you are setting out on this journey?
Yeah, I mean, startups are just such an unusual space because you don't have lots of the institutional infrastructure that you would normally have in an established business. You don't have the kind of ways of working, the ways of doing things, the ways of organizing yourself. And so I think it's very easy to come up with reasons not to do things. And so you kind of need to overcome the sort of inertia inherent in not doing something. People tend to make a lot of come up with theories that are unvalidated and then say we can't start doing anything until we've done this thing that is just a theory. So it can be very difficult to kind of find your way to how to start. So, for me, I mean, my number one piece of advice around this is probably like find some experienced startup people to do it with you, because people that have done startups before have kind of learned some lessons. And so one of the things I'm really enjoying about Tend is working with Cecilia and James is been just such a pleasure. All three of us have done a number of startups before, and so we've kind of got some experience. We can recognize some of the patterns, we can recognize some of the obstacles, and work out how to overcome them together based on kind of our shared experience in the past. The other thing is that you just need to start, and that requires a huge amount of bravery. But actually, the most important thing is to start doing things. I was talking about this the other night, but the most important validation you can ever get in a startup is someone paying you for a service or a product. And I find a lot of startups try and delay that as long as possible. Whereas my view is I hate building something where someone's not paying me, because there's no feedback mechanism to tell me whether or not the thing that we're building is the right thing, or the service is the right quality, or it's delivering the right outcomes. So we had quite an aggressive goal to launch our product within 12 months of really kicking off. So I think I started in end of November 2019, working on this with Cecilia and James full time. And we launched in October 2020. Now, we had a pandemic in the middle of that, which changed quite a few aspects of the business in some ways, and in other ways not so much. But we were able to assemble a team, build a minimum viable product, build our first medical center from scratch, and launch that within 12 months. Now, it required access to capital, and it required finding talent and all those kind of things, but it's really important to set aggressive goals, because if you don't, then you won't make any progress at all. And I think one of those goals has to be, when are we going to actually sell this to our first paying customer? That was actually one of my first big milestones, was, okay, let's pick the date where we're going to go live and work back from there in terms of what are the things that need to happen to make this work.
What do you think, for those who are looking at learning from startups, what do you think are some things they could look at when they're looking at transforming their enterprises from a startup mentality? I think it can be very difficult to, in large organizations, things get very intermingled. You end up with lots of crossing dependencies and lots of confusing kind of reporting lines, systems that are kind of half interconnected or not interconnected enough. And so it can be really hard to kind of simplify the problem space down enough to actually go forward. But I think it is possible to do. Certainly, by the time I was wrapping up at PushPay, it was a large enough organization that it was getting harder to do things. But to some extent, I think you need a leader that's willing to use force of will to make things happen. It's like, okay, it's kind of, I hesitate to use a military metaphor, but it's kind of like, okay, we're going to achieve this objective. Let's all rally around this and then go and achieve this goal together, because we've agreed that's the right thing for the business, or the right strategy, or the right thing for our product or our customers, or whatever it is. And certainly, even in larger organizations that I've worked in, it's possible to do that. But it requires really, 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 really excellent leaders. And it requires a really, really excellent narrative that everyone buys into. So I think, really good leaders are great storytellers. At least in startups they are. I don't know if that's the case necessarily in larger, more traditional organizations, but in startups, because a lot of, even now for Tend, lots of what we want to be, we are not yet. So we have to continually remind ourselves, what we are now is not who we're going to be. We're on a journey to get to this place. Here's where we want to go. This is why this is important. These are the values and the hopes and the aspirations about why these things are important. And this is where we are now. And this is the things we're doing to get there. And even in large organizations, I think you can do that. It's harder, but there's more communication, can be more politics, there's more dependencies and more complexity. But I think ultimately it requires really, really good storytelling and really, really strong intent and support, probably from an exec team, to support that objective and then make it happen. And you see it happen regularly, businesses go through existential crises where, something dramatically changes in the market or in a line of business or a service, and you have to respond really rapidly. And when those things happen, successful organizations can overcome those things by aligning everyone around a common goal. And my question is, why aren't you doing that all the time, really? So as Chief Product and Technology Officer, you're obviously a key part of Tend and its product. But in what ways do you collaborate and influence the wider organization and the leadership team there?
Yeah, so we have kind of an interesting structure. We have two CEOs, which is, it's not unheard of. In fact, it's getting more common, but it's still a little bit of an unusual structure. And then with Cecilia and James, we've got a CFO who's responsible for kind of finances and financial strategy and planning and stuff. And then we have a chief strategy officer who's kind of head of networks. So he runs the kind of physical infrastructure. And then I run the digital infrastructure. And the idea is that we kind of blend those things together. So, and then we've got a chief people officer, and we've got a couple of other functions. We've got a chief medical officer who kind of sits around us, kind of supporting us from a clinical safety and workforce perspective, and from a kind of people experience perspective. So when we're kind of working on big initiatives, it really is kind of getting all of those brains in a room to align around what we're trying to achieve, and then kind of going back to just basic kind of, management systems to figure out, okay, how are we going to drive towards this objective? What do we need to do and how?
So you mentioned earlier, the power of storytelling, and that really resonates with me. And I agree. I think it's definitely a key thing for any leader, regardless of their role, to get really good at. Are there any other key attributes you think make a really successful modern day CIO, CDO, CTO, Chief Product and Technology Officers? What are some of the key attributes, do you think, when it comes to leadership?
I think it's probably a few things. I mean, I really, really do think that great leaders are good storytellers. So, we've talked about that. I think being able to kind of communicate candidly can be really important. I really love Radical Candor. I forgot the name of the author at the moment. But as a book, I think that's a very good kind of framework for thinking about how you communicate with teams and staff. In terms of from a kind of management communications perspective, most people that have been hiring young people these days are doing quite a bit of recruitment at the moment. 20-year-old, 25-year-old people that are in the workforce and they're kind of second or third job, they have really high expectations from employers about their own development and progression and how their employers are going to support that. There's amongst people leaders that I know, there's some complaining about that, some frustration around entitlement or just how needy some of these people are. But I think it's great because ultimately they're just giving you clear expectations for what they're looking for. And it's up to you as a people leader to kind of respond to that and set some frameworks and some boundaries and say, hey, look, yes, we will absolutely develop you in your career. This is the bit that we're going to do. And here's our expectation for what you're going to do. And that's not a particularly complicated conversation to have. And when you have it, people are like, cool, that's great. That seems like a completely reasonable approach. Let's do it. So I think, being able to have candid conversations, and then so storytelling, candid conversations, and I think having the ability to handle conflict and deal with teams that are not effective in different ways, and using kind of a bag of different strategies there is really important. The thing that I've kind of ended up finding my way into over the last 10 years is really focusing on what's sometimes called blameless culture or just culture, which is really trying to help people work through not so much who is responsible for something going wrong, but how did something go wrong and how can we improve the system to make it easier to avoid that kind of failure mode in the future. So, and that's the foundation for me of becoming a really high velocity learning organization. So I think if you can embed the ability to learn from mistakes or errors or things going wrong in your organization, you build an organization that gets more resilient as they take on more things. And there's a really nice flywheel that occurs there. So how do you create a culture that enables people to take risks and make bets in a way that doesn't penalize them when they don't play out or when things go wrong or when things haven't kind of gone perfectly?
Look, you've touched on this a little bit there, but, it is an employees market, and especially in IT, people, do have a lot of choice about where they go. So when it comes to Tend, how are you creating that internal culture? And you mentioned there a few things you're doing around that just culture. Are there any other things that you look at to really help your employees, feel like they're valued and that they're in a place where they can thrive?
I mean, I think Dan Pink's book, Drive, is kind of, the masterpiece on this in my view, and he kind of says that there's kind of the three things that people need. So it's autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And I don't necessarily talk about this deliberately or intentionally in that with that kind of framework, but I think that captures the essence of what the sort of the criteria you need to create a successful culture. And so, it comes back to basics. Are you giving people objectives as opposed to giving them tasks? Are you letting them work out how they're going to solve the problem rather than telling them how to solve the problem, just making them do it? Are you thinking about how you can progressively stack more responsibility on people as they have kind of demonstrated mastery, so that they're feeling developed but not unsupported. And tying that back to a really clear purpose. And so for Tend, the purpose is like, we want to make New Zealanders one of the healthiest countries in the world. And that's a great goal. Like, that's a goal that I think it's very hard to find someone that's going to object to. And then the question is, how do we tie the purpose of the organisation to your purpose and your work, and how you're doing connects to the outcomes that we're trying to drive for the organisation. And at our scale and size, that's really easy because we're still relatively small with fewer than 100 people. But I think that the challenge with that always is, how do you, and it comes back to storytelling, like how do you continue to retell the story of how the work that this person has done or this team has done has impacted this outcome, that delivered this outcome for the business, for customers, or for, you know, for a country or a system.
So another, key factor for any high performing team is diversity, and IT has suffered in the past, even though it's getting better, from, especially when it comes to gender or people from different backgrounds not considering IT as a career. What kind of practical things do you think should be considered to get more people into IT and better reflect the Aotearoa that we live in?
I mean, it's a really difficult tension to hold, because most technology leaders and most hiring managers just have, if you've got a gap in your workforce, you just need to fill the gap, and probably it's hurting not having someone in the seat. And so there's kind of a trade-off between short-term thinking and long-term thinking here. But for me, I'm a big fan of kind of attempting to have a diverse shortlist of candidates for any position. So typically I won't start interviewing until I've managed to assemble a shortlist that includes people from multiple different backgrounds or life experiences. The culture that exists in an organization is the minimum standard of behavior that leaders will allow to occur. And so I think there's things that you can just call out and say, hey, look, can we have a sidebar conversation about this? This is not acceptable, or this is not appropriate. And that's not necessarily kind of the obvious things about inappropriate comments or kind of the big things. I think there's a lot of smaller coaching opportunities to talk to people about making sure they're giving people a chance to talk in meetings that are not necessarily the extroverts or the really kind of talky people, making sure that the kind of dynamics of groups allow people with different kind of modes of interaction to also get a chance to express their opinions and to be heard and to be listened to and to kind of help contribute to things. So there's a whole kind of bunch of different ways to approach that. But I think, having some intentionality around that.
Josh, when you reflect back on your own career, is there any, mistake that you might have made that when you look back on it, it really shaped you as a leader?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've made a ton of mistakes, but I think I started my career as a technologist. I come from a software engineering background, really, and so I've always been quite closely aligned with how products get built, how we solve technical problems. And in the first part of my career, that was my job. My job was to kind of be the expert, to be like, this is going to be complicated or hard, or there's dependencies here. My co-CEOs love to hassle me for saying that a problem is non-trivial. They say that's Josh code for it being really hard, or I'm not interested in trying to solve it, which is kind of true. But I think it took me a long time to recognize that as a leader, that was more of a weakness than a strength, because the important thing for leaders to do is to identify opportunities and help lead a team to solve them, as opposed to identifying where the challenges are going to be. And quite often in exec team meetings or even in board meetings, I would end up thinking and talking about where the technical challenges were as opposed to where the opportunities were. And I didn't really understand how that came across to people that didn't come from a technical background. I think there was just a naivety around my understanding of that. And so in a 360 feedback session at the exec team 5 or 6 years ago, someone who I really respect wrote this feedback for me, and I knew who it was. It was meant to be anonymous, but it was kind of obvious. And they said, when people are looking to you to lead, you sound negative. And it was really, really good feedback. It really, I was like, the feedback where you know it's true. And so it hurts even more. You're like, that's totally fair and it's right, and I need to rethink this. But it really changed how I approached conversations. I'm not saying that I'm perfect at this now, but I am much better at kind of focusing on the opportunities and leaving the details to the team rather than still feeling like it's my responsibility to work through the details, and I can leave that to really trusted people that I have in the group that can kind of figure out how to solve those problems, and I'll focus on where do we need to go as opposed to how are we going to get there.
So then what advice would you give to someone who is aspiring to be an IT leader?
I think there's been some nice developments, I think, over the last 10 or 15 years around things like just culture. I think there's a really good book called Nonviolent Communication that's also kind of quite popular in the tech community, or has become popular in the tech community over the last 10 years, along with some of Sydney Decker's work around human factors and failure in systems. And I think because of what technology people do, there's inherent risk in what we do. You know, a small mistake can have very, very serious consequences for a business or for their customers. And in the past, especially when IT was more of an internal support function, a cost center, if you will, rather than a revenue center, I think there's been certainly in places I've worked in the past, there's been quite almost punitive culture where when things go wrong, it's kind of like, okay, who are we going to beat now for this project going over budget or for the system going down in a critical moment? And I think you don't need to be the leader of a function to start using some of the techniques and tools and some of the literature to help facilitate useful conversations about how we make the system and the processes for supporting those systems better for everyone. And certainly in organizations that have been in the past, sometimes those ideas have been introduced to those organizations by individual contributors, not by their leaders, and have actually made their way up the stack rather than kind of coming from the top down, which I think is great kind of inside leadership. You know, just because you're not the manager doesn't mean you're a leader. So I think how do you develop your people skills is probably the most important thing. And likewise, how do you develop your storytelling skills? Because I think great storytellers tend to naturally end up in people leadership roles over time as they get recognized for being able to inspire and drive people towards an outcome.
Absolutely. Now, Josh, it's been, a big year for Tend, and we're heading into 2023. It's coming up on us fast. So what's important to you in the months ahead?
Yeah, we've got, again, really, I think the startups that I've worked in that have been most successful have set really ambitious goals for themselves. They give themselves clear, measurable goals with clear timeframes that are ambitious, maybe even aggressive. So we have had a number of really aggressive goals over the last sort of 12 months, and we've got more coming up. And so it's just a matter of kind of holding ourselves accountable to the goals we've set for ourselves and continuing to focus on that and not letting ourselves get distracted. There's a well-known, well-worn saying that startups don't die for a lack of opportunity, but for a lack of focus. And so certainly we've really doubled down our discipline on focusing on the core strategic enablers that we need to focus on this year to deliver the vision that we have for what we want Tend to become over the next couple of years.
Well, a big year ahead, and we'll watch with interest as Tend goes from strength to strength. Josh Robb, Chief Product and Technology Officer at Tend, kia ora for your time today.
Kia ora koutou.